Okay, everybody. Well, it's my absolute pleasure and privilege to be with you this morning. I'm talking to you from Madrid, and it's been totally amazing to see all the places where you are all working. So many people from so many places around the world. Some of you probably coming to this webinar before you've even had breakfast, which I'm so impressed about. Others of you hanging in there probably quite late in the evening when you could be just watching something on Netflix, and here you are. So I'm delighted to be with so many teachers from all around the world. It really is an absolute pleasure. As Will says, I'm a teacher and a trainer, and I'm based in Madrid in Spain. And that's the main place I've worked in my working life, though I have also worked in Germany and in England, and I've done teacher training sessions all over the place. So moving on, let's have a look at what we've got on today's session. As the title slide says, we're looking at promoting student wellbeing through English. Just one second here, there we go. Yes, as Will mentioned, I'm also an author, so as well as a teacher and trainer, I'm an author and one of the author team on Macmillan's new secondary school course, which is called Get Involved. Okay, so like so many of you, the past 2 years have been a pretty crazy time for me. We went from teaching face-to-face, teaching normally, to suddenly having to go into lockdown and teaching online in a matter of days with no training. Then from there, after a while teaching, from the kitchen with everyone at home jockeying for the Wi-Fi, then we moved on, or moved back in my case, to what we call bimodal or hybrid teaching, where you've got half your students at home and half in class. That's a bit of a nightmare to manage. Now we're back in face-to-face, but we've got all this news about the new variant that's coming. It's a pretty scary time. So what we're going to be looking at today is that the effects that all this has had on young people and what we can do about it. But I would just like to mention briefly here, I also did a session on the Advanced Learning Cafe on teacher wellbeing. So if you're interested in checking that out, I think Will put a link to that in the chat at some point, maybe a bit later on. Okay, so let's move on to what we're doing in today's session. Really, we're going to look at 3 questions. The first is, why should we be concerned about student well-being? Why is that an important issue for us as teachers? Then we're going to move on to look at social and emotional learning, what it is. And then finally, we're going to get practical, and we're going to look at ways to incorporate social and emotional learning into our classrooms. Okay, so that's the structure of our talk today. What I'd like you to do, first of all, is just to think about some of your students. And what I'd like you to do is to think about your difficult students. Perhaps students who you feel aren't doing too well right now. We're looking at this area of why we should be concerned about student well-being, and I'd like to just focus it on real cases that you have in your classrooms. So perhaps if you can think of maybe a student who doesn't seem happy right now, a student who's not really fitting in with other students in your class, maybe someone who you think has got things going on in the background that you may or may not know too much about. Perhaps this has led them to act up in class, to behave badly, or be a difficult person to manage. Just take a moment and write down a few names of students who fit this description. We've all got some. Okay, so I'd like you to keep the name or names of those students handy. And maybe from time to time during the session, just have a look at them and see if what I'm talking about perhaps relates to those people. Now, I think it's a really, really tough time to be a teenager. Teenagers generally have a pretty tough time, but I think at the moment things are probably worse than they ever have been, or worse than they've been in a long time. So let's look first of all at some of the things that concern teenage students. The first one is themselves, starting at home. Adolescence is a time when many teenagers are struggling to come to terms with the way they look. They generally don't like it. Most teenagers don't like the way they look, or they don't like a part of how they look. They may not be happy with their body image, the image that they present physically to other people. And at the same time, they may be struggling with the transitions of adolescence in terms of finding their identities as they move towards adulthood, perhaps having difficulty with both personal and sexual identity. So the first thing they have problems with is themselves. The next thing is the people around them of their own age. A lot of teenagers struggle to fit in, to feel part of a group. And it feels so important to be part of a group when you're a teenager. This is linked with the idea of being attractive to others, to having the right appearance that makes you attractive, to having the right ideas that makes you attractive. And being attractive is important if you're starting to want to find a partner. Of course, peer pressure is a really important problem for many teenagers. But how teenagers react to peer pressure varies a lot. Now, I have two daughters. They're both in their early 20s. So fortunately for me, I've managed to get through adolescence as a parent, and it wasn't easy. But my daughters couldn't be more different when it comes to peer pressure. My younger daughter, Maya, is very self-reliant. She's quite confident in a quiet way. She's self-assured. And amazingly, she's never been that bothered about peer pressure. As an example, she's now 24. She doesn't drink. She never has. She doesn't smoke. She never has. And I'm not just saying it because she's doing it behind my back, but I know for a fact that she hasn't. And she never gave in to peer pressure when she was at that complicated teenage age, adolescence. However, her sister, Rona, has always been one who needed to be part of a group. She's changed her appearance many times to fit in with her friends and to belong, have a visual identity with a particular group of people. And she's always been very, very susceptible to peer pressure, to the extent that when she was a teenager, she really suffered at times, feeling that she didn't belong. Nowadays, of course, there's tremendous pressure on teenagers to post some kind of perfect existence on social media, to be seen to be having the right kind of life. And of course, there's also bullying, which is one of the worst types of relationships with peers. Moving on then, teenagers also have problems in their relationships with adults. Their relationships with parents are changing. A lot of parents can find it difficult to accept that their children are no longer children, but are adolescents, that they're moving towards adulthood. There can be also difficulties with siblings, with brothers and sisters. During the teenage years, young people become more aware of the difficulties that their families are going through, whether those are emotional difficulties to do with relationships, or perhaps economic difficulties to do with financial hardship. The other adults who teenagers come into contact with, of course, are their teachers. Those may not always be easy relationships, particularly as they move towards the end of their school years and an increasing pressure to succeed, to do well and to pass exams. So very complicated dealings with themselves, dealings with their peers, dealing with adults. And of course, this is all with the backdrop of the future, this horrible thing which is looming and teenagers feel they've got to engage with quite soon. They're having to become more autonomous, more independent, more responsible. That in itself is very frightening. But coupled with the uncertainty about what they're going to do next after the safety of school is over is even more worrying for many teens. Are they going to go to university? Are they going to get a job? What on earth are they going to do? And then, of course, in the current climate, we've got these really big world issues which are making everything seem even more worrying and depressing. The pandemic, unemployment, climate change. So really all of this makes it no surprise that there is a mental health crisis going on with our teenagers. In a typical class of 30 children, 5 are likely to have a mental health problem. That's a massively high proportion. And half of all mental health conditions start by the age of 14. Those are really vital years in seeing that people are experiencing well-being or are experiencing difficulty. Bullying is also a big issue. 1 in 5 students report having been bullied, and of those, 41% think that it's going to happen again. And then, of course, the events of the past 2 years, the pandemic, has made things a lot more complicated. One study in China showed that 37% of Chinese adolescents were experiencing anxiety near the start of the pandemic. And other studies from Italy and from India have shown increasing levels of behavioral problems and anger and anxiety among young people today. So it's really clear that there is a mental health crisis, that young people are experiencing psychological distress, anxiety, and depression. Now, as teachers, I believe we have a responsibility to do something about this because these young people are in our care. But also just thinking about ourselves, young people who are having difficulty are more likely to be complicated to deal with in class. So if for no other reason than helping ourselves with our classroom management, this is an issue that we need to address. Okay, let's move on then. Having looked at why we should be concerned about student well-being, let's move on to the next part of my talk, which is what is social and emotional learning. Now, in a research article from 2016, David Osher gave the following definition. He said, social and emotional learning is the processes by which children and adults acquire and apply competencies to recognize and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, appreciate the perspectives of others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, make responsible decisions, and handle personal and interpersonal relationships constructively. Now, I think that's all good stuff. I think we can all relate to that. But personally, I find it quite a wordy definition. I find it a little bit of a thing to get my head round. So I'd like to go back to a definition that was put together by the Collaborative for Academic, Social and Emotional Learning, commonly known as CASEL, back in 1997. And they brought social and emotional learning down to 5 points. The 5 key areas are as follows. Self-awareness, which is the ability to recognize one's own emotions, values, strengths, and limitations, to know who we are and what we believe in. Self-management, which is the ability to control our emotions and our behaviors and manage them so that we can achieve what we want to achieve. We can achieve our goals. Moving away from ourselves then we come on to relationships with other people. The first area here is social awareness, recognizing the emotions and emotional state of other people, showing empathy, and then moving on from there, looking at our relationship skills, how we can build relationships with people and how we can deal with problems using things like conflict resolution when problems arise in relationships. And finally, if we can do all these things, then we can make responsible, ethical decisions about our personal and social behavior. Remember, as Will said, by the way, this PowerPoint will be available to you. So don't feel you need to make notes, although sometimes I do that because that's the way I process information, but you'll be able to look at all this again later on. So these 5 points that Cassel came up with are very often represented in the following way, as a circle. The 2 points in orange relate to ourselves. The point in green relates to our relationships with other people. And in yellow, we can see this responsible decision making. And sometimes this, this diagram is also expanded so we can see that it starts in the classroom with the climate that we manage to create with our students. But for it to be successful, it needs to move out and permeate out beyond the classroom so that the whole school has a culture where social and emotional learning is important. Families and caregivers can also be integrated into helping support young people and their development, as can the broader community. Okay, so we've now been looking at what social and emotional learning is. Let's get on to the practical part of my talk, which is how we can incorporate social and emotional learning into our courses. Okay, so I think there are 3 ways that we can do this. The first is that we can look at our normal course books that we're using, because a lot of them will contain topics which are relevant to social and emotional learning. So I'd like you just to do a little task for a moment while I have a drink of water. I'd like you to think about a typical course book, maybe one that you're using now. What topics, what themes come up in that course book that could have relevance to students' social and emotional learning? Just take a moment and maybe make a note of a couple of topics you can think of. Okay, so I had a look at Get Involved to see what topics we have there. And I think here are some topics I noted on the left-hand side. These are quite typical course book topics, but I think all of these could lend themselves to focusing your students on social and emotional learning, things that are going to help their well-being. We're just going to look at a couple of examples of this. So here we have an opening spread of a unit. And as you can see, the topic of the unit is goals. And if you look down underneath the visual, you've got this nice big visual, but underneath we've got a bit of vocabulary work, and I'm just going to give you a close-up on that. So here, first of all, the students need to match these expressions to the pictures that they saw in the visual. And then they're going to take those same verbs and look at the collocations with other expressions. So for example, we've got win a race, but down below, win a prize or win a competition. We've got get a good job, get good grades, etc. Learn something new, learn to surf. So it's typical vocabulary work helping to expand our students' range through collocations. But a little bit further on the page, we come to this. In this activity, the students have to classify the activities, the different things they've been learning about on the previous page, into things that they believe are important or not important. There's no right or wrong answer here. This is a question of personal opinion. Doing this is part of students' connection with self-awareness. It's helping them be more aware of what their own personal values are, to recognize who they are. Okay, let's look at another piece of material from a course book that would work in terms of helping students' social and emotional learning. Here we have a reading text. It's from a unit about food. And as you can see, it's looking at different foods that you can eat depending on how you're feeling, and making sure you're eating the right things to do you good in that particular situation. So again, if we look at the castle wheel, here we are focusing students on, for example, responsible decision making. It also links with self-awareness, so recognizing how you're feeling in a situation and then making an appropriate decision about it. Okay, just moving on for one more example. Here we've got a couple of grammar exercises. On the left-hand side, we're working on gerunds and infinitives. And on the right-hand side, it's a grammar roundup, bringing together all the grammar students have been learning recently. But at the same time, these two exercises are talking about something more than just grammar. These are not just random sentences about Mary and John and what they did in their imaginary world. No, the first text is about exercise, and the second text is about anxiety. So once again, we are helping students look at these areas of self-awareness and self-management. So it's quite easy to see that in our course books, we can incorporate social and emotional learning. Possibly you might have to make a little exercise of your own to extend the course book material, but we can see here a couple of examples that are included in Get Involved as an easy way to focus students on two things at the same time, on grammar and on their well-being. Okay, so that's the first area, using things that are in our course books anyway. The second area I'd like to move on to look at is using projects. Now, I'm a super big fan of using projects. I think they bring us so many opportunities. Projects give us a chance to review language, but also to integrate all students' language knowledge. They give us a chance to play to our students' strengths so that we can incorporate abilities that our students have beyond just English language into our projects. The artistic students can have the opportunity to do a beautiful display. The more mathematically minded can do a more statistical project with a survey and reporting results. Projects can mark the way stages in our course. So when we get to the end of a unit of work or the end of a term, we can do a project to bring everything together. They're very motivational because they have an output, a piece of work at the end that everybody can see and admire. So these are all reasons why I think projects are fantastic anyway. But projects can also be really handy if we want to work on our students' social and emotional well-being. Let's have a look at some examples of how we could do this. So in this first project, the student's task is to make a map of their town. The language that has been focused on recently is there is and there are, and places in a town. So places like bus station, art centre, and so on. And as you can see, the students need to produce an annotated map. They label the map with information. There are lots of fast food restaurants at Tower Park. The Lighthouse is a cinema and art centre. There's a department store here to go shopping with your friends, and so on. But the important part of this task is this is a map for young people moving to live in your town. So the students aren't only thinking about themselves, they need to think about other people. If you look in the center of the page, you can see a pink box, and I'm just going to give you a close-up on that. So here, we are asking students to use their critical thinking skills to consider the needs of other people. We encourage them to think about what other people like, not just themselves. And we give them phrases and expressions to use when doing this. What about somewhere for people who like blah, blah, blah? Oh, there aren't any places for people who like, Okay, so we're helping students think about other people. So here we're definitely working on social awareness. We're showing empathy and understanding for other people. And so you can see what this project looks like a little bit more. I've got a video for you to watch now. Here we go.
Hello. So, this is a map of our town Poole. Poole is a town on the south coast of England. Poole is a small town, but there are lots of cool things to do, and it's a great place for teenagers to live in. First, if you're looking for a place to hang out with your friends, there's a really nice park called Poole Park, which has a juice bar and a big lake. It's a great place on a sunny day.
Or if you prefer a place where you can do exercise, there's another cool park by the sea called Beta Park. There's a skate park, and I love going skateboarding there with my friends at the weekend. On a rainy day, you can go to the Lighthouse, which is a cinema and art centre. Poole has also got many cheap places to eat. Take a bus and go to Tower Park. There are lots of fast food restaurants there.
So, this is our town. What do you think of it?
Okay. Oops. It always happens. That video restarts. It wants to show itself again. Okay, so you can see that that project is helping lower level students think a lot about their environment and thinking about other people. Let's move on to a project which is suitable for students at a slightly higher level, but moving on to older teens. In this case, their task is to create a podcast giving advice to listeners about their friendship problems. So straight away we can see we're looking at relationship skills. The focus here is on empathy, trying to understand the situation from another person's point of view and avoiding being too judgmental. And again, we've got tips and we've got key phrases. So let's just have a look at this video now and see the work that the teenagers came up with.
Right. Jack and Alice, are we ready to do this podcast?
Yes, I think so. Everyone's got their own mic, right?
And a script.
Okay, so Jack's going to start with a short introduction to the podcast, and then I'll introduce you as Dr. Baker.
Okay, so here we go. Welcome to the Teen Life podcast. First of all, let's introduce ourselves. We're Jack and Alice, and we're your hosts today. Coming up, we have a special edition, which is all about friendship, and we'll be dealing with your problems.
Yes, we're going to be reading some of the emails you've sent us, and we're going to talk with Dr. Baker, who's an expert in psychology.
Hi everyone.
Okay, so let's get going and read the first email, which is about friends who have fallen out.
It says, "Hi, I wonder if you can help with a problem I have with a friend. So, this friend, let's call him Paul, has made some new friends, and he hangs out with them more than with me. He doesn't speak to me much anymore. I feel a bit lonely, and I don't know what to do."
So, Dr. Baker, what do you recommend?
Well, a lot of teenagers often have this problem, don't they? Have you tried speaking to him? Does he know how you feel?
That's good advice.
It's important to be honest with friends and talk to them. Maybe he doesn't know how you feel or thinks you don't like his new friends and don't want to spend time with them.
I agree with that.
Now we've time for another email. This one is from Maria, and she says that she's been finding it difficult to work together with some classmates recently. She feels that her classmates don't listen to her opinions.
That's another difficult situation. Again, communication is important. You should talk to them. Let them know how you feel about this. Be positive and say that it's important to consider everyone's opinion and point of view. If that doesn't work, maybe you should talk to a teacher.
You've been listening to the Teen Life podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it. Catch up with us again next time when we'll be discussing your problems related to exams. Thanks for listening.
That sounded great.
Yeah, well done.
Wait, is this thing still on?
Here we go again. Let me just see. To the next slide. Let's see. Ah, there we go. Oh, I hate technology. Okay, sorry about that little glitch there. I hope you can see that project as a really lovely way to get students addressing issues about relationship skills. Okay, so clearly they're thinking about self-awareness, they're thinking about social awareness, and they're thinking about relationship skills when they're doing this project. Okay, so that's two ways we've looked at of incorporating work on social and emotional learning into our classroom. We've looked at using what's in the course book anyway, and we've looked at the idea of using projects. We're going to move on to look at a third way now, and this is designing lessons with targeted content on social and emotional learning, targeted SEL content. So my idea here is that as well as doing the things we've already seen, we might have some lessons where our specific focus is on this type of topic. Now, I'd like to propose a framework that you can use for these lessons, a tried and tested framework. It's got 4 stages. The first is that we lead into the topic. Obviously, we're not going to get our students talking about anything unless we warm them up and engage them and take them with us on the journey that is the lesson. Then we need to make sure that they've got the language they need in order to talk about the particular subject at hand. Following on from that, they might need a few ideas, a bit of input, some things to get their thoughts going, and an opportunity to process those ideas. And then very importantly, I think they need a chance to relate the content to themselves, to discuss, to reflect, to personalize, and maybe to think of what they're going to do next. So this is the kind of framework that you might use in a skills lesson, a listening lesson, or a reading lesson. But in this case, the content is related to students' social and emotional well-being. So we're going to look at 2 examples to show you what I mean. So we're going to do the lead-in to my first sample lesson. I'm not going to tell you at this point what the lesson's about. You've got to try and work it out. I'm going to show you a short text with some missing words, and you've got a minute or so to try and decide what the missing words are. Here we go. Okay, so there's a bit of a clue in the first line with the words buses and trains. Hopefully you've worked out what the other words are. So when we use public transport, like buses and trains, it's important to think about other passengers. Everyone wants to have a comfortable journey. It's also important to think of people who need to sit more than we do. So the focus of our lesson is on being a good passenger. It's a lowish level lesson here. We're talking probably an A1 plus or an early A2 level. Okay, so this is one part of our lead-in. We get the students to complete this puzzle and work out the missing words. And then we could lead into some follow-up questions like, what public transport is available where you live? Do you travel on public transport? Why or why not? Things like that, just to get students relating it to their reality. Another way we could lead in would be to use some quotations. Can you decide which people here are good passengers and which are bad? Okay, so these activities are designed to get the students engaging with the subject. Let's move on a little bit. The next stage in our 4-step plan is to focus on vocabulary. So here you have to match the images that you can see with the descriptions of the people. So if you'd like to take a moment just to do that, obviously it's quite easy for you guys. Okay, and then moving on from there, we have some input. In this case, it's in the form of a poster of do's and don'ts for using public transport. And the students need to match the captions on the left with the pictures on the right. Let's just take a moment to do it. Okay, so number 1, use headphones to listen to music. Number 2, put your bag or backpack on the floor. Number 3, speak quietly. Number 4, don't sit on the floor. Number 5, give your seat to people who need it. And number 6, let people get off before you get on. Okay, so we can see here that we are encouraging our students to think about other people. Moving on, the students now need to match these pictures to slightly longer text, but this is all giving them input on the topic. So if we look at the first text, text A, please think about older passengers, pregnant women, people with children, and other passengers with difficulties. So we need to match that to one of the pictures, and it is, of course, picture number 5. Now, with your students, you would probably be asking the question, why? Why are these things important? Why is it important to put your backpack on the floor, not on the seat? Why is it important to let other people off first? Those are the kind of questions that we can encourage our students to be thinking about. Moving on from this, our students need the 4th stage, which is the opportunity for reflection. And here I've got 2 different ideas. The first, which is a little easier, is that students have to look at some more rules and decide the 3 that they think are the most useful to add to the ones they had previously, and to explain why. On the right-hand side, students need to complete some sentences which allow them to reflect on what they've learnt. And notice we've got things like, when I'm on public transport, I try to, thinking about behaviour that they currently do. But also on public transport, I sometimes need to remember to, we're encouraging our students to think about ways that they can improve their behaviour in those kind of contexts. So if we go back to our castle wheel, we can see that in this lesson on being a good passenger, we're encouraging our students to be socially aware and to make responsible decisions in social contexts. Let's move on and look at another lesson at a higher level. This is for older teens, probably looking at a sort of B2 level. And it's on managing anger. Now, one way you could lead in straight away would be to use this photograph. What's the relationship between these 2 girls? Where are they? What are they doing? How does the student on the left feel? And what about the one on the right? Why is the student on the left pointing at a map? So all those questions would help students start engaging with the topic of anger. Another lead-in is to reflect a little bit on our own experience. Perhaps you could take a moment now to think about this for yourself. Okay, I hope I haven't left any of you feeling too bad. I look back at that and I thought about a conversation I had with my husband earlier today. Okay, let's move on. So we've led in now, we've engaged our students with the subject. And now remember the next stage, stage 2, is to make sure they have the vocabulary they need to talk about it. Now, at this higher level, we're looking at collocations, and we've got some lovely expressions here relating to anger. So just take a moment and see if you can decide which verb goes into each space, 1 to 7. Okay, so we've got some really useful language here. Have an argument, raise your voice, lose your temper, keep calm, control your emotions, owe someone an apology, very nice phrase, ask for help. This is really useful language in general for students at this level, but obviously particularly pertinent when we're asking them to discuss this area. So moving on to the third stage, we need to give our students some input, some things to think about. Here we have a text. I've just got part of it for you. It's a series of guidelines on what to do when you get angry. So what I'd like you to do is just read the text in step 2 and decide which of the expressions in the box are mentioned in this text. Okay, so we've got the idea of getting calm by breathing slowly and also noticing where we have tension in our bodies when we get angry. So some things to think about and to get students thinking also about techniques that they can use when they're feeling angry. The final stage, remember, is an opportunity for reflection. And here again, I've got 2 ideas. On the left-hand side, reading what some other people think and seeing which ones you identify with. Now, these are designed to help people notice the type of situations that trigger anger. For example, I know with one of my daughters and my husband, they invariably get angry when they're hungry. And it drives me mad because I think it's so easy to avoid, okay? But it's really important for them to become aware of it, not just me. Another thing is, again, a sentence completion activity. And once again, if you look at the activity on the right, you'll see that we finish off with this: next time I get angry, I'm going to try. So we are consciously trying to help students deal with their emotional responses. So if we come back to the castle wheel, we can see that this lesson focuses students on self-awareness, on becoming aware of what their emotions are, what their triggers are, and then self-management, how to deal with it, perhaps through breathing, perhaps through noticing the tension building up in your face, all those things that we've looked at in the lesson. Okay, so just to remind you again, we've got this framework for lessons, four sections: lead in, focus on vocabulary, provide some input and some food for thought, and then an opportunity for reflection. Now, this could be a lesson that you do in class, but equally you could use the same framework to give students work to do at home. So I'd like to wrap up our session now and move on just to conclude with a few thoughts and ideas. The first one is about limitations and responsibilities. Obviously, I think it's really important that we help our students with their social and emotional well-being, but there are limitations to this. There are some things which are too delicate for us as teachers to deal with in a classroom context, and they should be left to experts in mental health. I'm thinking of things like self-harming, eating disorders, domestic violence, big issues which may be very, very relevant and painful for some students in our class to deal with. So I think do leave things to the professionals. I think we need to keep things pretty general. But I do think we have responsibilities as teachers to be looking out for our student well-being, for helping them to be healthy, happy individuals. And I also really believe that the English classroom is the ideal place for this. There are opportunities we have that other subject teachers don't have. For example, if you're a maths teacher, you need to input formulae and you need to practice formulae. But if you're an English teacher, you need to input language and you need to practice language. And it doesn't matter what you're talking about. You can be practicing language in all kinds of ways. Remember this exercise we saw earlier. It's on gerunds and infinitives. It's practicing grammar. But at the same time, it's helping students engage with their well-being through thinking about responsible decision-making about exercise. The other thing is that the English language classroom is innately communicative. We must talk. Our students must talk together to practice language. So what they talk about can be any number of subjects. And of course, we've seen some of the ones today, which would be at the same time very useful for their social and emotional learning and development. Another reason why it's really important to work on this is that positive emotions lead to the secretion of dopamine and serotonin in the brain. And those are things that we really need in order for our brains to be working well for learning, because they increase focus and attention. They help our students remember things, and they increase motivation. So those positive emotions are going to have a real impact on how well our students do with their learning. But they're also going to have a real impact on how our students feel. Students who are happy will miss fewer classes, they will become more conscientious, and they will do better. So that's surely something that we want to encourage. So I would just like to leave you with two circles. If we focus on the circle on the left and attend to our students' social and emotional well-being, we can take them to the circle on the right, which is a virtuous circle where one good thing leads to another. Students who know themselves and are in tune with their emotions are going to be better able to manage their behavior. They're going to be ready to be empathetic to other people. They're going to have better relationships with other people. They're going to be happier students, and that's going to lead them to be less of a problem in our classes. So those are all good things. And I really feel that there is so much we can do, and that we really need to make our students' well-being a priority. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for being here and listening. If you're interested in reading more, there's an article I wrote on the Macmillan blog. And as I said, there's also an advanced learning cafe session on teacher well-being. So I'd like to finish there. Thank you very, very much. And if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to write them in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Kate. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Thank you.
Good stuff. Thank you very, very much. What a presentation. That was so interesting, so full of advice as well, which I think is the main reason why teachers come to a webinar like this, is to have plenty of things to take away and actually practice in their classroom today. So thank you very, very much for thinking about them in that way. Very much appreciated.
Great.
So we've had a couple of questions, if that's all right with you.
Okay, absolutely.
So the first question we had was, they were talking about I think it's quite a straight answer, but someone was asking about when you were talking about project work, and they're asking whether this is appropriate for English language lessons. And I think, just to be clear, I think you were actually assuming it is primarily for English language lessons, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, obviously we can do project work in many different subjects, but I'm an English teacher and I use projects in the English language classroom because, as I mentioned in the talk, I think they tick so many boxes. They allow us to practice language. They allow students to shine who aren't necessarily the best language learners in our classes, the artistic students, the creative students. They can provide an object for evaluation if that's something that you need to be doing alongside tests and exams. You might want to use a project as a better way to evaluate your students' overall abilities. They can bring all their language knowledge into play at the same time. They provide a wonderful object to go on the wall, or for parents to come in and see. Very often parents don't know what we're doing in our classrooms. So we can actually show them a piece of work that their kids have produced. It's tremendously motivating. So yes, totally. And as I've shown you, I think they can also really be useful for getting students to work together and develop their empathy, their collaboration, and all kinds of social skills.
Absolutely. And I'm also talking about emotional skills, it fosters a tremendous sense of pride, I think, in the students, doesn't it? You mentioned the final piece, but that's also something else they might sort of feel, as you said, to motivate them, that they're really creating something they're going to be proud of at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And I think also projects can be so different. They're so varied. You can have projects which culminate in a poster, in a play, in an audio guide, in a comic strip. There's loads of different things, and maybe it'll vary according to the time that you have available or your students' interests. But I think they're a real way to motivate students. And as you say, this end result, a piece of work, something they've done through English is fantastic for the kids.
For sure. Yeah. And if I could add one more thing to it as well, that it's actually really excellent practice for real life, for when they enter the world of work. This, taking your webinar, for example, this webinar that you're delivering today is the end product of some work that you've done, and we've collaborated with you on Macmillan Education, have collaborated with you, and there's been all sorts of skills that we've been practicing throughout that. Absolutely. Which are practiced in these projects that you've been talking about.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's just a very complete language activity, but so much more at the same time.
For sure. Okay, so another interesting question we just had as well. So I'm just going to read the question to you, because it's not too long, but it's just long enough, I think, for me just to be able to read it to you. So they have a question. When you raise a topic of doing the right thing in whatever situation, for example, healthy eating or behaviour in public transport, how do you push through or possibly change some teenagers' belief that doing the right thing isn't cool? So some things that you're talking about there don't really fit in with the ethos of some teenage groups, perhaps. So how do you infiltrate that belief system?
That's a very interesting question. I don't think I have a magic wand answer either. I think teenagers are always going to look at things with a certain amount of skepticism, but I think teenagers also have a big social conscience. I think, it is worth considering, if we're looking at things from other people's point of view, rather than me trying to sell you what I think you should do, perhaps exploring the effect that behavior has on other people. So, for example, rather than me saying, if you're on public transport, you shouldn't sit on the floor, you should turn your music right down. Maybe just thinking, okay, let's look, here are 3 sample people who are traveling today. What effect is your behavior going to have on each of them? So, here's an older person. They're a bit deaf. They can't imagine it's your grandma. She maybe can't hear very well. Maybe she needs a seat because she's tired. So maybe kind of getting students to relate to it, perhaps connect with people they know, might be a better way of doing it than just trying to tell them what they should be doing. I think kind of guiding them to draw their own conclusions would be the way I would go with it.
Excellent. Thanks, Kate. Okay, so another question. Let me just scroll through them. So, you spoke about connecting with students and trying to, I mean, that the video that you showed was the podcast of those children making a podcast was talking about talking to the students. So the question is basically, what if you don't really get much feedback from that? And you're trying to connect to the student, you're trying to delve into how maybe they're disrupting the class because they've got something going on and you would like to try and find out why. What do you do if they don't really respond, if they're not really up for it, if they don't really want to talk to that teacher?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we've always got to recognize that a teenager may not be ready to have that conversation at that particular point. But I think what we need to do is show that we are ready and we are available, and that we care. I think teenagers need to see that there are people who are points of reference for them, who are approachable. So I think it's a question of showing that these issues are important, and just guiding them to different options they have, different people they could talk to, showing that you have an open door, but not forcing it, because they will. I remember a wonderful, when I was having difficulty with my kids when they were teenagers, my elder daughter was a particularly complicated teenager. And a friend at the time sent me this brilliant analogy, which is that teenagers are like cats. So a cat will walk haughtily into the room like this with its nose in the air, and it will decide if today it's going to sit on your lap or if it's going to ignore you completely. And a teenager is pretty much the same. They will walk into the room, and some days they'll be loving and sweet, and I speak as a parent, and some days they will be horrible and they'll ignore you, or they'll walk away with their tail in the air. So I think that, you know, you can't push conversations with teenagers, but what you can do is show that you are there and keep those channels of communication open, and, you know, maybe they'll use them when they're ready.
Okay, great. Cheers, Kate. Okay, so another question is talking about, you, as you mentioned before, you did an Advancing Learning Cafe last week on specifically looking at, well, more looking at teacher wellbeing rather than student wellbeing. So it's kind of, I think this question looks at both of them. So in class, as I'm sure you've experienced, as I've experienced, emotions from the teacher obviously bubble up sometimes when things get, you know, things can get pretty excitable, and excitable is putting it lightly, in a teenage classroom full of teenagers. And so if a teacher's emotions are starting to boil up because several students are perhaps being quite destructive because of their own emotional situation, have you got any advice for teachers for that particular moment in the classroom where emotions are bubbling up on both sides?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. And I did have an incident. So though I teach university undergrads now, I do have some who behave fairly much like high school students. And I had an incident with a student recently, and she was pressing my buttons, you know, she was making me angry.
Right.
I have to say, I felt really, really fortunate that I was wearing a mask. One of the few times that I feel grateful for wearing a mask is when I have emotions that I don't actually want to show. So that's quite useful. But I think the thing with particularly with anger, which I think is the emotion it tends to stir up, is to try to stop things escalating. And that includes in yourself. Take it down a notch, because I think our natural tendency is for things to go woof, to kind of explode, and we feed off other people's anger. But I think obviously as teachers, we have to be on the moral high ground for one thing. We have to control our emotions. We need to get on top of our emotions. But I think very often it's a case of breathing, of consciously lowering your voice, not shouting, keeping your voice at a steady, calm tone, trying to switch the dynamic in some way, perhaps giving students something to get on with so you can take a little, not a break that actually going out of the classroom, but a sort of a mental break in the lesson. Have the students do something. Okay, I want you to write down 10 pieces of vocabulary we learned this week. Something like that, a task you can do on the spot while you can just sit for a moment and breathe and ready yourself to continue. But it takes a lot of self-control. Something we all
do. Yeah. Being a father of a 2-year-old and a newborn baby, Kate, I know exactly exactly what you mean. I'm just putting a link in the chat to Kate's Advancing Learning Cafe that she did last week, which looked specifically at teacher wellbeing. So that I think will also help to answer that question as well. We've got 1 more minute, Kate. Do you mind? Can we go for 1 more?
No, that's fine. I just want to say thank you so much. I'm just having a very quick look at the chat here. Thank you for all the very positive messages from people in the audience. Really, I really appreciate it. I wish I could see all your faces. It's very strange just speaking at a screen, but it's lovely to see the messages in the chat. And thank you so much for being out there and participating. But yes, Will, 1 more question if you like.
Okay, great. So it's a question on project-based learning.
Okay.
And it's not really looking at SEL actually. Well, it depends how you construe the question. But I don't think it is. How can one introduce cultural diversity in a class with collaborative activities like PBL, project-based learning?
Wow, that's a big question. How can you introduce cultural diversity? Well, I think one thing is to actually look at what diversity may already be in your classroom. A lot of us work in situations now where we do have students in our classes who come from different backgrounds. So I think a project could be an ideal way for people to talk about their roots. And that may not be necessarily their immediate roots, but they could be second generation migrants from a different place. So I think incorporating the kind of project which values and celebrates different cultures would be one way to go about it. But another one would be to actually assign different students different cultures to look at. For example, it could be a project on food from around the world, and different students have to go off and do research. I think one part of a project is the research element. So I think having set up a framework of what is expected, then the students could go away and each of them could research, the cuisine of a different country or a different group of people, and present that as part of their project.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kate. I think we've taken enough of your time this morning, Kate. You're doing this another 2 more times today, aren't you? You're doing it again at 2 o'clock?
Twice more later on.
And then once more at 9:30. Good stuff. So I've got a few more things to say, Kate. So it's up to you whether you stay here or not.
I'll hang around, but I'll maybe switch off my my video just now.
Great. Well, just before you do, Kate, thank you again so much for putting the presentation together and for being here and sharing all of your wonderful advice with the teachers. You've got a lot of thanks, a lot of love coming through on the chat box. I hope you can see that now.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day. Bye now.
Good, Kate. Okay, everyone. So I've got a few things to tell you about, some very, very exciting things. So as you saw in the talk just now, Kate has told us about the importance of developing social and emotional skills and the teacher's role in helping students develop a healthy mindset in today's ever so challenging world. What Kate also shows you with some examples from her latest course, which is called Get Involved, with an exclamation mark at the end. It's get involved, shout it, get involved. So Get Involved, I want to tell you a bit more about that course now. So it's a Macmillan education course. It's 6 levels. It's intended for teenagers, and it focuses on developing linguistic and super skills, and empowers students to speak about real life issues with confidence through collaborative projects, much like you just saw in Kate's talk and what we were speaking about in Q&A as well, the all-important collaborative projects. Get Involved creates an inclusive learning environment, which gives every student an opportunity to succeed and show their talents through these projects. So what you can do, if you want to learn more, you can have a look at the Get Involved website, and you can see how it supports students' social and emotional development. A lot of the examples that Kate just showed you were actually taken straight from the course. So if you liked what you saw, then go to macmillanenglish.com/getinvolved. The URL is on the screen at the moment, where you can download some sample sessions to give it a try. And if you like it even more, then get in touch with Macmillan, and we will happily give you access to the course. Secondly, we've got a very exciting thing happening. We've got a competition coming very soon. This is a brand new competition with an engaging real-life task and exceptional prizes, apparently. Because I've been told that they are absolutely exceptional. That's right, the word is exceptional. The prizes are exceptional, and it's just around the corner. So at the moment, you cannot actually go for the competition just yet. But what you can do is sign up, and we will let you know as soon as the competition is open. If you go to macmillanenglish.com/getinvolvedcompetition, the details will be shared with you very soon. On that page, you'll be able to give us your email address, and we will let you know as soon as the competition is open. So keep an eye out for that. It's going to be really exciting.